Hello and welcome to this evening's Science for All Seasons talk. The Science for All Seasons series gives you a chance to explore hot topics in genomics and biology with leading experts from the Broad Institute. My name is Tom Ulrich, and I'm the Associate Director for Science Communications here at the Broad. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening and to introduce our speakers, Nick Wagle, Elana Anastasio, and Colleen Nguyen. Together, Nick, Elena, and Colleen will give you an overview of Count Me In, a project that engages cancer patients everywhere in the United States and Canada diagnosed with any kind of cancer and enables them to accelerate cancer research by sharing their samples, their clinical information, and their voices. If you have any questions for Nick, Elena, or Colleen, please ask them using YouTube's chat feature, and we'll do our best to discuss them during the Q&A portion of the evening. And if you're tweeting, please use the hashtag BroadSFAS. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Nick Wagle, and with my colleagues, Elana Anastasio and Colleen Nguyen, we're going to be talking to you today about Count Me In, which is a research initiative that attempts to democratize cancer research, enabling patients across the country and Canada to share their medical information, their samples, and their voices with all researchers. I'm going to share my slides. Okay. So I'm going to give a few words of introduction and then turn it over to Elana and Colleen for the next part. But maybe first, I'll introduce myself. I'm a medical oncologist. I work at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and the Broad Institute. And a lot of the idea for this type of research, directly engaging patients, comes from the experience of oncologists treating cancer patients and really understanding what the potential opportunities are as well as the challenges are in cancer research. And so I want to start with an example from my own experience as a medical oncologist going back now about 10 years. This is a patient who was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma. This is a 38-year-old man who was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma back about 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago. And you can see from this picture that he has deposits of tumor all over his upper body. And this tumor was really resistant to all therapies he had received. Back at this time, there weren't any great targeted therapies or immunotherapies for melanoma. There were limited options, and all of the options, including experimental options he had received, were not working, and these tumors continued to grow. And we were able to receive a portion of his tumor, which we were able to profile in the laboratory. And we identified a particular mutation in his tumor that represented a vulnerability. It represented a drug target. And it turned out at that time there was an experimental drug called PLX4032 that targeted the specific vulnerability that we identified in this gentleman's tumor. And so he then enrolled on a very early phase trial, a phase 1 trial of this drug, and he had this really remarkable response. You can see his tumors completely melted away. Unfortunately, his story didn't end there. Although he did quite well for a couple of months on this therapy, several weeks after that, the tumor started to grow back again. And unfortunately, his tumors eventually developed resistance to this drug, and he died a couple of weeks after this third picture was taken. Now, he was very generous in able to give us one more portion of his tumor. You can even see the bandage there on his body where he had another biopsy that he was able to send us. And we studied that biopsy, and we learned why that tumor became resistant to the therapy. And although what we learned was not soon enough to be able to help this patient, it was able to help many subsequent patients by understanding how tumors become resistant to this therapy, and allowed us to develop new therapies and therapeutic strategies to help prevent or overcome this resistance in the future. So why do I show you this example? Well, one, I show you this example because this is one of the first examples that inspired me to do this kind of research and to try and understand how we can generate these incredible responses in patients, but how we can also prevent resistance from occurring. I show it to you for a couple other reasons. One, it highlights the potential of what we are trying to do in cancer research and cancer therapeutics. Try to find the right therapy for every patient and get these dramatic responses. And it also shows us the challenges. Lastly, it shows us what a single patient studying and partnering with a single patient can do to help promote and propel research. This gentleman shared his medical information and his samples with us and other researchers. We were able to make this important discovery that subsequently led to new therapies and therapeutic advances. And this got us thinking, well, if we can learn so much from a single patient, what if we could do this at scale? What if we could learn this amount of information from many patients with cancer? What if we could learn it from every patient with cancer? And so this is where the principles of Count Me In came in. And the principles are as follows. One, that every patient's experience with cancer should be counted. Two, that every patient should have the opportunity to share their medical information, their specimens, and their voices with all researchers. And three, that every community should have the opportunity to participate and contribute to research so that cancer research advances reflect every patient and every community, particularly those who have been underrepresented or historically excluded from cancer research. The problem is that in the United States, most patients don't participate in this type of research. By some measures, 85% of adults with cancer in the United States are treated in community settings or small cancer centers where they receive their clinical care but are not participants in research. And certainly their tumor samples and their medical records are not studied to try and make these kinds of discoveries. And so most patient samples and data have not been readily available for study for the simple fact that most patients have never been asked if they would be interested and willing in participating in these types of studies. So Count Me In was born at a time about 8 years ago when times were changing, that technology, social media, and cultural changes, including more organized advocacy groups and more empowered patients, provided a new opportunity to engage cancer patients and their loved ones to directly partner with them in this kind of research. And so we launched this initiative called Count Me In, and it allows every patient to be able to share this information. This is a partnership between the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, the Broad Institute, the Emerson Collective, and at the time, the Biden Cancer Initiative. And quite simply, the goal is to enable cancer patients anywhere to share their information and samples with researchers everywhere. So we're very excited to share some information about Count Me In and some updates about the work we're doing, some of the scientific progress, and some of our efforts to try and be as inclusive and representative as possible. So with that, I will turn it over to Elena to talk about the next part. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks everybody for being here. My name is Elana Anastasio, and I'm the Associate Director of Count Me In, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about our history. As Nick mentioned, Count Me In is a research movement that is deeply committed to making every cancer patient's experience count. We believe that any and all cancer patients can have an impact on the future of cancer research by sharing their experiences and their samples. Count Me In began in 2015 with the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project, with the aim of enabling any patient in the US or Canada with metastatic breast cancer to be able to participate in research, no matter where they live or are treated. The project was built in lockstep with the patient and advocacy community through a year of conversations, learning, and planning, and patients were involved in every aspect of the design and development of the project, from the project website to the surveys patients fill out to the kits that patients use. Patients can join by visiting mbcproject.org to fill out a short survey and sign an electronic consent form, which asks for permission to send them a saliva kit, request copies of their medical records, and to collect stored tumor samples and an optional blood sample. And we've seen an amazing response to the project. We've had over 6,200 patients who have joined, over 3,200 who have fully consented to participate. We've now received over 2,000 saliva samples and over 1,100 blood samples, all providing the opportunity to move this research forward. And these patients are truly coming from all over the US and Canada, from over 1,700 different treating institutions, many in those community settings that Nick mentioned. These are patients who would not have had the opportunity to participate in research without this approach. And these patients have also helped drive the project forward, sharing with other people what the project means to them. They themselves created what they've dubbed saliva kit selfies, sharing their own experiences of taking the kits and sharing a sample and posting it on social media so that others could learn more about the project. I'm going to read just a few quotes from patients themselves about the impact of being able to participate. From Houston, I want to live and watch my children grow up, but if I can't, then I want to leave a legacy and a cure. From Lake Tahoe, as someone who does not live near a research center and therefore cannot easily participate in trials, I finally feel like I can contribute. After seeing the response from the metastatic breast cancer community, we wondered whether we could use the same model in a rare cancer. Angiosarcoma is a rare and aggressive sarcoma with only about 300 patients diagnosed a year and very little research that's been done to better understand and treat it. We launched the Angiosarcoma Project in 2017, and the power of this approach, particularly in a rare cancer, was quickly apparent. The preliminary data analysis from just 47 tumor samples has led to the development of a new clinical trial for angiosarcoma patients. And from here, we wanted to apply the model to other cancers as well. We've since successfully launched projects in 4 additional cancer types: metastatic prostate cancer, esophageal and stomach cancer, osteosarcoma, and primary brain tumors. And we've now released data from 3 of these projects. We've seen over 50 citations of the data to date. The approach is working. Patients are joining. We're able to generate and share data, and researchers around the world are using this. After seeing the last several years' response from the patient community, we really demonstrated the power of this approach, that patients want to be involved. They want to share their voices and their experiences, that this method can lead to important discoveries that have a direct impact on patients. And so in August of last year, we launched a new platform at joincountmein.org that enables any cancer patient with any diagnosis to be able to be involved in research. Everyone who joins Count Me In can provide a saliva sample and answer questions about their cancer experience. And there's tremendous scientific value in being able to learn and study this large cross-cutting group of patients that represent many different cancer types, many different demographics, and many different treating institutions. This approach also enables us to launch and study specific cohorts of patients, not just in a particular cancer type, but also that cut across cancer types, such as patients who have received a particular therapy or fall within a particular age group. The first of the focused cohorts that we've launched is focused on colorectal cancer, and patients can join at the same website that enables any cancer patient to be a part of this movement. At the same time that we launched our new platform, we are also thrilled to work with Stand Up to Cancer and Uzo Aduba to launch a public service announcement, sharing more information about Count Me In with people around the US. And we've seen an amazing response. We've had over 1,100 patients from over 125 different tumor types who've joined Count Me In, and we're just at the beginning. We believe that we need to reach more people, but in addition to just reaching more patients, we also need to reach more specific groups of patients, specifically those who have been historically excluded from research. Colleen Nguyen now is going to tell us more about some of the community engagement efforts at Count Me In.
All right. Thanks so much, Elena. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share our work with you this evening and for joining us. My name is Colleen Nguyen, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager here at Count Me In. And I'm focused on engaging in underrepresented communities into our cancer research processes. This evening, I'll be sharing with you why these efforts are necessary and how we, alongside communities, are going to make it happen. But before I jump into all of that, I want to start here. I'd like for you to meet Miss LaTanya Wilson. LaTanya was one of the first patient advocates I met when I first started at CMI over 4 years ago. Born in Sumter, South Carolina, and raised in a family who believed in service, she joined the military at 17 and eventually served over 12 years in the United States Army. Now, she was initially diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer at 32. And over the course of her journey, she would be re-diagnosed with breast cancer an additional 3 times, eventually being diagnosed with stage 4 or metastatic breast cancer in 2016. Sadly, she died this last August at 45 years old. You see, the thing is, LaTanya's story isn't uncommon because for Black women in America, this is what cancer looks like. Black women in the United States are more likely to be diagnosed with breast cancer at younger ages, later stages, and die at higher rates. They're also more likely to be diagnosed with more aggressive subtypes, of which limited treatments exist. Now, cancer inequities extend to Black men too, of which 1 in 6 will be diagnosed with prostate cancer in his lifetime. And Black men are also more than twice as likely to die from the disease compared to their white counterparts. And of course, this list goes beyond race. There are disparities that exist for adolescents and young adults with cancer, as well as those in the LGBTQIA+ community, and at many other intersectionalities, because in this country, cancer isn't equal. Now, we know that while there are stories to be found in numbers, we can't understand the entire story without looking at context. And the reality is this, that many Americans face financial, structural, and personal barriers to healthcare, which includes cancer treatment and follow-up care. A few examples of this are inadequate health insurance, access to reliable transportation, language barriers, and even provider bias. These are just to name a few. Now, adding to the complexity, as Dr. Wagle previously mentioned, is that in the context of cancer research, 85% of cancer patients are treated outside of comprehensive cancer centers. So consequently, most cancer patients aren't even being asked to participate in research at all. So what does that mean and about who is participating in research and who isn't? What are the implications for minoritized communities in this country? Like cancer data at first glance, that's not all. The implications of biases in participation are vast. In 2018, ProPublica, in collaboration with Stat News, published a piece on Takeda Pharmaceuticals' promising new drug for multiple myeloma called Ninlaro. The FDA approved of it in 2015 after patients in clinical trials gained an average 6 months without their cancer spreading. Sounds pretty promising, right? Now, what you should know is that 1 out of 5 people diagnosed with multiple myeloma in the United States is Black, and African Americans are more than twice as likely as white Americans to be diagnosed with blood cancer. Of the 722 participants in the clinical trials for Ninlaro, only 13, that's 1.8% of participants, were Black. In a subsequent 2017 journal articles, FDA scientists raised the question of Ninlaro's effectiveness for Black patients, writing, quote, "Meaningful differences may exist." The truth is, this is not new. This ProPublica analysis of the data that was made public by the FDA at the time found that in trials for about 77% of the cancer drugs approved since 2015, fewer than 5% of the patients were Black. And in comparison, Black people make up 13.4% of the US population. And this isn't limited to Black patients either. Almost 2/3 of the trials didn't report any Native Americans or Alaska Natives. And it wasn't until 2017, 5 or so years ago, that the FDA included a category for Hispanics, distinguishing between white and non-white Hispanics. So, if you're wondering why we should care about all of this, this is why. Representation matters. What other implications are there? And why is engaging underrepresented populations in clinical research, specifically cancer research, so challenging? Look, to understand why we are purposefully choosing to change how we engage communities in our cancer research at Count Me In, we have to understand our role and our history in it, as scientists, researchers, clinicians, and beyond. We must understand that minoritized communities in the United States have been underserved, historically marginalized, disadvantaged, and taken advantage of, which has led to repercussions within science and in particular research that we still see today. Studies have shown that our long history of these atrocities has led to deep distrust amongst marginalized communities with the scientific and medical establishment, and honestly, rightfully so. If we're going to do something about this, we need to talk about the history of someone like James Marion Sims, who developed pioneering tools and surgical techniques related to women's reproductive health, and in which he conducted his research on enslaved Black women without anesthesia or their consent. He caused untold suffering by operating under the racist notion that Black people did not feel pain. If we're going to talk about this, we need to talk about the Tuskegee experiment, which I'll speak of more in a minute, and we need to talk about Henrietta Lacks and the utilization of her cancer cells to advance science. These actions, atrocities, and dare we say betrayals, all done in the name of science. But perhaps the most notorious of them all was the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. The Tuskegee study was a 40-year experiment run by U.S. Public Health Service officials. The study followed 600 rural Black men in Macon County, Alabama, with syphilis over the course of their lives, and in which U.S. public health officials refused to tell patients their diagnosis and refused to treat them for the debilitating disease, despite a treatment existing. Now, during the course of the study, research papers were published. And here are a few of them. 1936, 1954, 1955, and 1963. This is science made progress at the cost of Black lives. And the men and their families, they never knew. Now, whistleblowers brought an end to the study in 1972, which ushered in the era of modern medical ethics, starting with documents like the Belmont Report, which you see here. But research has long suggested that the damage had already been done, that the ill effects of the study had already extended beyond those men and their families to the greater whole of Black culture. And the truth is that while there have certainly been events in history that we can attribute some of these challenges to, we can't deny the legacy of racism at the root of those events or the reality and lived experiences of those navigating the world and system as it exists today. Because frankly, history persists. A 2016 study by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences revealed that half of first and second year medical students that they surveyed believed that, quote, Black people had thicker skin than white people, end quote. These types of racially biased beliefs have been connected to the undertreatment of Black patients for their pain. And it's not just patients or, human error. Articles from the New England Journal of Medicine have highlighted the bias that exists in diagnostic algorithms and practice guidelines that correct outputs based on a patient's race or ethnicity. These issues are pervasive and insidious. There also remains a lack of representation and opportunity both in the medical and scientific workforce as well as in clinical research. And you know what? That's where we stand, at the intersection of clinical research. Beyond racism and distrust, there are other known barriers to participation, some of which I've already talked about. Time, travel and transportation, language barriers, a lack of information being available, and patients not being asked to participate in it at all. But all of this, it doesn't need to be this way. It can change. The future can change, but it has to be done hand in hand with communities long excluded and impacted by the diseases we study and the work that we do. It has to be done together. As previously mentioned, CMI started as an initiative that would break down some of those barriers and challenges and allow researchers to partner directly with patients to accelerate cancer discoveries. Patients in the United States and Canada can consent to participate in the study and share their clinical information, samples, and experiences, and participation is free. Both Dr. Wagle and Elana have spoken about the progress made thus far, but what I want to focus on now is how that framework, in a way, a democratization of science, reflects in our approaches to community engagement at Count Me In. Within community engagement, there are some key principles and processes that we hold to help ensure that members of the community are with us every step of the way. First, that relationship and partnership building begins at the very start. Now, whether it's an email, phone call, or direct message on Twitter, we're in search of partners for this journey because we know we can't, and more importantly, we shouldn't do it alone. Trust and transparency are crucial. They're not just principles, they're actions. That means communicating our challenges, our successes, any progress that is made, even if it's the littlest of news. So much of science and research continues to be like a black box. Things go into it, but very little comes out and is shared with the community itself. How can you build healing and trust when the process is entirely one-sided? The next thing is the truth is ours to own, good and bad. And that means owning our history and the roles we've played. If we are able to move forward, we have to own that truth and work on building something new and transformative with communities themselves. And yes, sometimes that leads to some difficult and uncomfortable conversations, but those are conversations that need to happen if we want to move forward together. Another principle, continuous feedback is imperative in ensuring that the needs of the community are reflected, and implementing and following through on the feedback given by the community is crucial in keeping us accountable, but also ensuring that community is with us every step of the way. Now, over the last few years, we've directly collaborated with members of the community across various parts of the United States to launch a number of pilots and initiatives. But for today, I'm going to talk about one specific project. I'm going to share with you about a new effort that we're launching in parallel with our cancer research projects, and one that's fully focused on bringing the voices and experiences of those in the Black community to the forefront, and will hopefully spark new conversations around what it means to be Black with cancer in America. Built in direct collaboration with members of the community, the Amplifying Black Voices Across Cancer, or VOICES digital initiative, is one that's been a year plus in the making. Now, this digital initiative aims to lift and shed light on the lived experiences of Black patients, loved ones, caregivers, and advocates across all of cancer. And the hope here is that by amplifying these lived experiences and voices, ones that are often unheard, excluded, and disregarded, we can collectively drive towards more actionable, lasting, and transformational change within cancer research itself. Learning from what participants have shared and incorporating it into how cancer research works is a start. And this is what our journey has consisted of thus far. For the first portion of the engagement journey, we started with listening. In previous conversations with members of the community, what were some of the ideas expressed in voice? Was there something that we had overlooked? Now, the idea of a digital space, a website for which to share stories and lived experiences was one. And so, why not bring the idea from the community back to the community and build it in partnership and alongside them? Second, we reached out to those familiar and new to CMI. For those who were familiar with us, we reconnected. But not only did we reconnect, many connected us with those who had yet to hear about or participate with us. And the other approach that we initiated was cold messaging and outreach to those who self-identified as patients, loved ones, caregivers, and advocates, but had never heard of CMI. And from there, we scheduled time to have open and honest conversations about the idea, approaches, and any other related suggestions and feedback. And if those we spoke with felt inclined, they could commit to not only participation within the initiative itself by sharing their voice and story, but really in any capacity they desired. If they didn't want to share their voice but wanted to help shape the project and conversation, they could do that too. Over a period of several months, we then began synthesizing those ideas, feedback, and suggestions, and have gone through multiple rounds of refinement. And currently, we're in the website development phase and have soft launched, but I'll get to that in just a second. What I really want to focus on and emphasize on this slide is that this project is a serious exercise in listening. And not just listening, but following through on what's been shared and expressed with us, being partners on this project and process. I want to take a minute to talk about what came out of those initial discussions and conversations and how all that feedback will eventually be incorporated into the final project itself. Now, in the numerous conversations that we had with members of the community, of which over 80 active partnerships and relationships were developed altogether, there were 6 key takeaways that the community wanted to incorporate into this project. 1, that Black voices should be at the center of the project with a focus on patients, loved ones, caregivers, and advocates for this first iteration. 2, that anyone with any cancer type could participate. 3, understanding on our end that transparency was crucial in making this happen. Without transparency, trust could not be built between our team and the community. 4, that this project needed to be built organically. 5, that the project focused on amplifying lived experiences and on shedding light on the disparities or inequities that exist for Black people in this country, especially in the context of cancer. The community also wanted the potential opportunity to find and build connections with those on a journey not that different from their own. And last but not least, it was made very clear to us that the project would require and include a resources page, one that would provide and list the organizations serving the cancer community so that anyone, whether they be a patient, advocate, loved one, and even a member of the general public, could potentially find resources that they may need, regardless of where they may be on their journey. Now, these key takeaways are important because it not only keeps us accountable, but it's also about ensuring that members of the community are actually, in many ways, leading these efforts. There's a lot of talk about representation, having seats at the table. But the truth is that transformational change can't happen without ensuring that there's decision-making power in those seats too. And this is one example that demonstrates an approach that has worked for us. All right, so let's get back to that soft launch. Right now, if you'd like to visit and sign up for the mailing list or know someone who might be interested in participating, you can. The URL is www.blackcancervoices.org. And I'd like to share with you a brief clip from one of our participants, Mr. Corey Manning. By day, Mr. Corey Manning is a director of youth mentorship at a local Boston nonprofit, and by night, he's a comedian who loves making people laugh. Now, in this video clip that I'm about to show you, he touches upon his cancer experience as well as why he believes it's important for people touched by cancer to share their stories. All right, if you can please roll the video.
I know that I'm not the only one. I know that I had cancer and didn't know it. There are no symptoms. I don't remember anything about Home Depot that day. I just enjoy making people laugh. I love taking people out of their moment, whatever they're going through. I don't remember what I went in there for. I don't even remember if I had a basket. And the phone rang, it was the doctor. He was like, I don't know how else to say this, but just to say it, you do have cancer. It was a punch in the gut. By sharing our stories, it helps us and helps others to get through this together.
All right. Before I end, and you may be wondering how to get involved if you're interested. Well, here are 3 ways to potentially help right now. First, if you are someone who has ever experienced cancer in your life as a patient, whether you are undergoing active treatment or in remission, you can sign up for free and participate in accelerating cancer discoveries for your cancer right now. Go ahead and visit our website, www.joincountmein.org. Second, if you're on social media, you can follow us to stay informed on the latest updates on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all the kind of similar accounts, but at Join Count Me In on Facebook, at count_me_in on Twitter, and at Count Me In on Instagram. Third, you can share this initiative with a friend. Or 3, this entire effort began through collective word of mouth and continues to be powered that way. Last but not least, I really just want to part with this. This really could not have been done without the community itself. Patients, loved ones, caregivers, advocates, researchers, clinicians, community leaders who have shared their time and lives in partnership with us are at the heart of Count Me In. Before I end and open up the floor to questions, I just want to say this. I'm sure you all know that this is a long road, that this doesn't happen overnight in 1 year or even 2. What we're aiming to do constitutes a systemic change within cancer research. And systemic change is slow and hard and can feel seemingly endless. But it's something, it's something we at CMI will continue to strive for. But it's something we also have to actively choose to move towards every day. And in community engagement, that's listening, being truly intentional in what we do, and following through on what we say. The way the world is today isn't what it should be. And that future world, what it should be, isn't dictated by us as researchers either. It's built hand in hand with the communities that live these experiences in these spaces. Cancer equity is achievable, and I hope you're able to join us and communities in making it happen. Thank you.
And thank you, Colleen, and Elena and Nick as well for everything you've said tonight. Before I dive into the questions, I do want to encourage anyone watching, if you have been diagnosed with cancer, if a family member has been diagnosed with cancer, or a friend, please consider encouraging them to sign up for Count Me In at joincountmein.org. We do have a few questions that have come in so far, and so Nick, I'm going to toss the first one over to you. You talked about obstacles that keep patients from engaging in research, but let's flip that a moment. What are some of the obstacles that CMI faces in trying to reach patients who they think might want to get involved?
Thanks for that question. I think one thing that we've learned over the last several years is that when patients sign up for Count Me In, we know how to do most of the next steps, finding their medical records, finding their tumor samples, sending them a kit in the mail so that they can provide a saliva sample or a blood sample. We know how to bring them all to our central lab at the Broad Institute. We know how to do the genomic sequencing and the analysis and sharing the data. All those things work. It's really getting the word out and making sure people are aware of Count Me In and aware of how easy it is to participate, that it's free, that it's available to everyone, that it's nonprofit, that it shares research publicly with all researchers. All of those elements, making sure that information is out there and that everyone with cancer has heard about Count Me In and knows how to sign up. To us, that is the biggest barrier. And so one of the things we're working on is finding out just new ways to engage and get the word out and identify patients. That's doubly so, as Colleen just so eloquently talked about, for patients in minoritized communities who may not have been included in research so far, who may not be part of the typical channels that research is promoted in. And so that's why we have these efforts to make sure that we are meeting people where they are. We are going to the patients wherever they are, to the communities wherever they are, messaging in the way that makes sense and building trust. So for us, that's our biggest challenge.
And then sort of a follow-up to that, apart from CMI, which again, everyone should join, what are some other ways that patients who might be interested in participating in research, what are other ways that especially if they're being treated at community centers and not in academic centers, what are other ways to increase their access to the ability to participate?
Yeah, well, I think there are two parts to that question. There are multiple kinds of research. There is interventional research, like a clinical trial where patients are asked to participate and are given the opportunity to use some new therapy. And then there is research like Count Me In, which is studying information or samples and trying to learn about cancer and trying to develop new approaches. Both are potentially available to people even when they're cared for outside of large cancer centers. But I would say the onus is on the research community. Right now, that kind of research is not necessarily made available to patients wherever they are. Count Me In is trying to do that. There are other programs trying to do that. But we really need a movement in the cancer research community to try and democratize this research, including things like decentralized clinical trials that allow people to participate in clinical trials wherever they get their care, or reducing barriers, improving access. So if you need to travel, if you need to go somewhere to participate in research, ways to make it easier through either transportation costs, parking, patient navigators. There are lots of potential ways that research can be made more accessible to people wherever they are. Those conversations are happening, but there's a lot of work to do. I'll add that for patients who may be getting their care at smaller community centers or places that don't do research, there may be options. And what I would recommend is talking to your oncologist about what research options are available, if any, and then maybe working with them to identify research opportunities. But certainly, there are a growing number of decentralized programs like Count Me In that should enable people to participate wherever they are.
Thanks very much, Nick. And then one more question for you, and then I'm going to bring up a couple for the whole panel. So you're a cancer researcher, you're an oncology doctor, and you opened up with an example of a patient where we're sort of making baby steps towards cancer precision medicine. So what do researchers like you need in order for cancer precision medicine to really come to fruition for patients like the gentleman that you were talking about at the beginning of your talk? Is it numbers of patients? Is it diversity of patients, diversity of cancers, all of the above, none of the above? What do you think?
Yeah, that's great. I think all of the above. I mean, that was a pretty good list that you just rattled off there. I think a lot of what we are going to learn comes from patients. In many ways, patients hold this information in a unique way, and no one else has that. Patients know themselves best. Their data matters, and so that's really the whole inspiration for Count Me In. It's that when we can assemble large numbers of patients with diverse experiences, some of whom responded to some drugs, some of whom didn't respond to other drugs, we understand what their tumors look like. We understand what the patients, what their underlying genetic makeup is. We understand information about their experiences and their demographics and their medical record and their other medical history. And we put that together in large numbers. We can start to see patterns in the data. So for me, the number one is more participation, more data, pooling it, sharing it, taking it out of silos, making it available to the research community broadly, and let everyone take a crack at solving these mysteries. And that's ultimately the driving force behind Count Me In. I think there are parallel efforts beyond that, including laboratory work, studying cancer and precision medicine using model systems, the kind of work that my colleagues and I at the Broad Institute and elsewhere do all the time. It's a multifaceted approach. All of these things matter and work together. Any one of them is not going to solve cancer or accelerate precision medicine. It is the integration of all of them. And so the last thing I'll say is every one of these efforts can make great discoveries, but it's when all of them are integrated that we get the most power. And so I'm a huge believer in open data and public data sharing. It's a core principle of Count Me In. And the more research studies share that principle, the faster we're going to be able to get to these advances.
Colleen and Elena, I don't want you to think I forgot about you because I see you there on the screen. Um, if either one of you could take this one, how is CMI different from other efforts that are aimed at encouraging patient and community engagement in research? And I come at this from, I worked at a cancer center many years ago. We had what seemed to be a pretty robust community engagement program, but it wasn't like this. So I was wondering if you could sort of talk about what makes CMI kind of makes it different.
I don't know if you wanted to go, Elena, or if you want me to start. Either works, but I guess I can kind of take a shot at it. When I think about community engagement, especially in the context of clinical research, I think about it being very traditional in some sense, very top down in many ways. Patients and communities really aren't, not all the time, but like in some ways, it's not thought about until the very end when you might be trying to accrue, numbers into your study, or like thinking about, okay, we should be thinking about these, certain communities that may be greatly impacted by the disease that we're studying. I think what we do a little bit different at Count Me In is that we really think about that from the very start. At the very start of every single, research project that we've launched, including now that we're doing PanCan, or all cancer, sorry, and all stages, inviting patients and members of the community to come sit down with us and talk about what it is that they need, what it is that they may think about some of these research questions, how to go about shaping this approach. For example, with the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project, or the MBC project, everything you see on that website, the color scheme, the text, the questions being asked, those were, selected and refined based on feedback given by the community themselves. And I think that is what really makes us a little bit different. Members of the community and patients in particular are there from the very beginning alongside us as partners in this entire process. Oh, Elena, I was going to say you might be on mute.
Thanks, Colleen. I'll just add, we know we might not get it right the first time. As Colleen said, we work with patients from the beginning, but we also know that we're working with a small group of patients and that it doesn't represent every cancer patient within the disease or across all cancers. So we're also opening to continuing to evolve the projects. And I'll just give an example of that. The MBC project website, the image that is used on that website is different than the initial image that was used. And that's because we brought a group of patients, including some of the ones that Colleen has worked with, to the Broad to talk about some of the impacts of the historical exclusion from research for Black women in particular. And we brought up the website and we asked them, what do you think? What do you see when you see this? And their response to the image that was there was, that's a white woman hiking. And the initial image was also a silhouette, but we had gone through this with other patients and thought it represented many different people because of that, but it was clear that we needed to make changes to that. And so we continue to evolve the projects, both in terms of the graphics and the questions that we ask and the way we approach the messaging based on what we hear from patients over time.
Colleen, a couple of questions that have come in that I want to run by you. So you've spoken a lot about CMI's very important work in the Black community. Are there other communities that you're working with as well at this point, or that you're hoping to work with in the future?
Yes. So other communities that we are working with right now is the Spanish-speaking or Latinx, Latino, Latina, Hispanic community. We have expanded. We have translated the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project into Spanish, as well as the new Count Me In website, so that will hopefully increase accessibility to anyone who might be interested in participating in our research and studies that may, speak Spanish, or Spanish may be their primary language. Other communities that we are hoping to work with in the future include basically any marginalized or historically marginalized community in the United States and Canada. And that includes, Alaska Natives, American Indians, LGBTQIA plus communities. Those are things that we've begun kind of exploring, but have yet to really establish kind of like new pilots alongside those communities. I'm sure you know that takes time. You know, building relationships, building trust, building transparency, making those connections. It takes a little bit of time, but our hope is that hopefully in the near future you'll be able to see pilots that we've launched within and alongside those communities as well.
And that's a great segue into the next question that I wanted to ask you, which was about trust. This is one of the questions coming in from the audience. How do you build trust with patients who are suspicious about the medical establishment or medical practices?
That's a really good question. I feel like this question is one that's been asked for a really long time, not just by our organization or our scientists, but for many over the several decades and potentially centuries. But that being said, I think it really starts with conversation, having those conversations, being open and honest. I think what we really try to do at Count Me In is to be as transparent as possible with every single step. That means, like, for the Amplifying Black Voices Across Cancer project, I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of conversation about, here are some of our challenges. This is what we've been struggling with. This is why maybe the timeline has been stretched out a little bit more. So it starts with that. But when it comes to specifically suspicious about medical establishment and practices, I think it starts with that conversation. I think it starts with also sharing the realities of what research is like now. We have IRBs, we have regulations, there are certain policies in place that will prevent history from repeating itself. And obviously, there's always room to do better. And I think that by speaking with communities and partnering with them on all of our research, it's one way to build something completely new and different.
Nick, one of the things that's always fascinated me about CMI, and like from way back in the day when it was just the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project, was that you're not just interested in the clinical information, in the biological information, in the genomic information, but in the patient experience. Can you tell me or talk to us a little bit about what it is that you can learn from that patient experience, that patient voice that doesn't necessarily come through in the medical record?
Sure. Yeah, that is one of the great lessons that we've learned over the last several years, which is the importance of the patient experience and the importance and power of patient-reported data. What we do is we have surveys, and we collect this survey information from patients, and that survey information might be things that patients know about themselves, and so it's really easy to ask them, like their birth date, or when they were diagnosed with cancer, or where they live, their zip code. So it's actually much easier to ask someone directly that kind of information than it is to find it or abstract it from a medical record. We can also ask information about that you could also get from a medical record, but patients might very well know that at least as good as the medical record, and sometimes even better information about treatments and the details of their cancer. And it turns out in our programs, the patients know that information very well, and they can share it. And that leads to a very quick development of this kind of data that otherwise would be very challenging to abstract from the medical record, and sometimes it's missing. There are a couple other advantages of asking the patients directly. One is that medical records are notoriously incomplete and hard to get. And so we have to track them down. We have to get them. We don't have a centralized medical record system in this country. And so we get, sadly, faxes or copies mailed to us of medical records. And then our team has to sort through and sift through and find the information we need. It's a very time-consuming process, at the end of which we may not even get the information we need. If the information exists, it's often more likely to be able to get it when asking the patient. And then finally, there's a lot of information that patients have that just don't exist in the medical record. And it turns out that information is also really valuable. Things like detailed family history. That's usually not very well documented in the medical record, surprisingly. But if you look at medical records, sometimes the family history was asked once in the first visit. It's not updated. It's hard to find, maybe not accurate. But if a patient sits down and fills out a detailed family tree for you, that's more likely to be accurate than anything you find in the medical record. And that's powerful for science. And then lastly, things that patients tell us sometimes unearth new ideas. It might be about exposures, or it might be about concurrent medical diseases that they have that are related in some way. We don't yet have the power to be able to make those associations. You need a lot of patients to be able to see that. But we do think in the future that when we have enough patients participating in Count Me In, some of those associations might be really valuable and something that we never would be able to get if we just looked at medical records. So I'm a huge believer in the power of patient-reported data, and I think that is one of the most enabling aspects of Count Me In, and I'm really glad we made it part of the program.
Elena, in the past, you and I have talked about how patients respond to participating, and how sometimes they want to see the data that comes from their samples, the data that comes out of their records. What do you see in how patients, individually want to engage with the data that's being brought into CMI, but also that's coming out of CMI?
Of course. So we try to be clear with patients from the start, from the website and the consent form, that we're not able to share any individual results from their samples or their medical records back with them. But what we do is share anything that we've learned. And so we'll do walkthroughs of a poster that we present at a conference, or share with them, a publication that we found, or that we've gone out, to make sure that they are able to learn from it as well. And what we've found is that patients are less interested in even knowing about the individual data, but really in seeing themselves reflected. And this really came through to me when we first released data from our first project, the MBC project. And we actually went on a Zoom with a couple different patients who had been early participants in the project. And we showed them the data live on CBio portal, which anybody can access. And multiple patients started crying, just seeing, themselves reflected in something that's out there in the world, seeing the impact that their information could have on research. So I think, again, patients find it empowering to be able to share information, and just seeing, even if they don't understand or don't want to dig into the individual specifics of a data, seeing that it exists and that they were able to be part of that is very impactful.
One of the things that I know that laboratories, both here at the Broad and at other centers, are always looking for are opportunities to create new models of cancer in the laboratory, new cell lines, new organoids, laboratory materials that they can use to actually run experiments, look for new treatment opportunities, look for new vulnerabilities in tumors. Are there opportunities for the patients who participate in CMI to contribute a tumor sample, or in some way provide material that could be turned into a new cell line or a new model that could be used in the laboratory to make new discoveries?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that's very needed in the field, which is living models of tumors, particularly in rare tumors where we don't necessarily have a lot of models to allow laboratory scientists to test new ideas and new therapies. So we've worked closely with some of our colleagues at the Broad Institute to enable patients to share samples and get them transported to the Broad to turn into cell lines. And that's been successful, particularly in some rare cancers and in brain tumors. And so there's an ongoing effort to do this. Many of these patients participate in that as well as in Count Me In. It's not a standard practice we have in Count Me In. So every patient who signs up for Count Me In doesn't have that opportunity, because it requires an incredibly complex additional layer of logistics, because you have to get tissue live. You can't get a tissue that was biopsied, a year ago that's stored in a pathology department, which is how most of our samples come to us. But it has been possible in certain cases, and we're working with our colleagues to try and increase the scope of that and make that a little bit more commonplace. And it's a great question, and definitely a goal of ours.
Colleen, I'm curious about how the CMI model, in terms of engagement, can apply to other disease areas. Do you know if sort of the type of deep community engagement that you've been working on, could that lead to change for people who are being treated for other conditions like heart disease or other chronic or acute conditions as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I would want to say yes, because in I know there has been research and studies, for example, pilots launched in like barbershops, getting blood pressure taking, being able to talk about and treat hypertension. Those have all been relatively successful. So I would say yes, just thinking about the type of community engagement that we're doing. So yeah, I think that in principle, a lot of what we've been thinking about within the community engagement space should and could potentially be applied elsewhere and just in different contexts. I think that the principles that we go by, even with working with different types of communities, I think because we are so focused on partnering with communities and across all members of the community, that has made it relatively successful thus far. And I can't see why I wouldn't be able to translate elsewhere, at least for right now.
We're getting close to time, so I've only got a couple more questions that I want to ask. Nick, I'll start with you. To the best of your knowledge, what's been the biggest finding that's come out of CMI? I mean, I know the data goes out there, other research groups pick up on it and carry on their own work, but what have you heard so far? What have you seen so far?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's come out, and a lot in the works. I think the example that Elana highlighted to me is the best proof of concept of what we're trying to do, which is an angiosarcoma, incredibly rare sarcoma, 300 new cases a year, and so limited that we don't really have a great understanding of the disease because there are not enough people at any one institution to enable research to understand the underlying biology of angiosarcoma, and for that reason, we haven't made tremendous advances in the standard of care. And it's a very lethal disease in the advanced setting, and we don't really know what to do about it. And so CalMean was tailor-made for a disease like angiosarcoma because patients around the country signed up for angiosarcoma. We now have over 500 patients with angiosarcoma part of the project. That's a large portion of the number of people living with angiosarcoma in the United States right now. So that's an unprecedented opportunity to learn about this disease that wouldn't have been possible by a single institution or even a consortium of institutions. You really need to cast a wide net like this. And as Elana described, even just after the first 47 patients had signed up, this disease is so rare and so little is known that we will be able to see a signal. And the signal we saw was that in patients with angiosarcoma that affects the head, neck, face, or scalp, those tumors have a particular molecular signature. They have a high tumor mutational burden, which means that those tumors look like melanoma. And even more than that, they look like melanoma because it looks like those tumors are caused by UV damage. So that's something we never knew about angiosarcoma before. But now, because of CalMean, we know that angiosarcoma that arises in the head, neck, face, and scalp of patients is because of UV damage. UV damage can cause melanoma, and turns out it can also cause angiosarcoma. But the most important thing that's come out of that study is that, like melanoma is treatable with immune checkpoint inhibitors and curable in some cases with immune checkpoint inhibitors. And so we were able to look in the angiosarcoma data, and we were able to find patients that got that same therapy. They happened to get that same therapy and seemed to be effectively cured by this shot in the dark. And that's what led to the clinical trial that's now demonstrating that this class of therapies is useful in patients with angiosarcoma of the head, neck, face, and scalp. So that was all done in the span of a couple of years, something that might never have been thought of. And even if it was thought of, might have taken a very long time to do. So to me, that's like the ultimate proof of concept of CalMean and what we'd like to just do over and over and over again.
Elana, I've got a question that I want to ask you about eligibility. So we've talked a lot about how people with cancer now can take part in CMI. What about people who are in remission or who have recovered from cancer? Can they take part as well?
Thanks, Tom. That's a great question. Yes, now that we've opened up the platform, anybody who's ever been diagnosed with cancer can join. And so whenever they are in the stage of their cancer, whatever age they're at, they can join the project. And we're thrilled to be able to open it up and learn from everybody.
All right, so I have one last question, and this one's one to all three of you. So Nick, we'll start with you. Where do you see CMI going? Where do you see their work headed over the next few years?
Yeah, Well, I love our goal is to really continue to increase the scope and the scale of Calmien. It would be great to have tens of thousands of patients, hundreds of thousands of patients with all types of cancer signing up, able to learn from them, able to develop new therapies and standards of care for all types of cancer, rare, common, adult, pediatric. I would love then for this incredible engaged network of patient partners then to be able to turn that into more than just a one-way learning system, but a two-way learning system, and be able to then give back to patients and help influence their care, whether that means helping them with treatment decisions or even bringing clinical trials or new drugs directly to them by partnering with drug companies or other clinical trial investigators. And then lastly, what I hope for in the future is that this isn't just cancer, like the question you asked about earlier. We've already started helping projects outside of cancer launch in rare diseases and common diseases. And I think this is a model that can really extend to all patients or even all people and really learn from every person.
Elena, how about you? You've been with this project for a long time, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and in addition to everything Nick mentioned, I think also just seeing the expansion into other data and other research. I think we've started to see this of other researchers sharing data, of making it available, and I think we want more of that. I think seeing the impact of how research going out the door to everybody can help patients way quicker. I want all researchers to be doing that, to share their data out, to combine their data with others, because I think the only thing that we can do there is help patients.
And Colleen, you get the last word. Where do you see CMI headed over the next few years?
I would hope that we'd be, expanding our reach, especially in relation to community engagement, which is where I am, into other, historically marginalized communities, developing deep relationships and partnerships, and hopefully launching new cancer projects within those spaces as well at the various intersectionalities, which there are so many of. So yeah, that's my hope. Hopefully we can learn from each other, both from the community and vice versa, and do exactly what Nick had, originally said, which was to make it a two-way street, because that's how research should be.
Well, with that, on behalf of the audience, I want to thank all three of you for coming with us tonight and sharing all of this about CMI tonight. And on behalf of Colleen, Elena, and Nick, I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us virtually this evening. We hope you enjoyed tonight's talk. And if you liked what you heard, then please consider watching some of the other talks from the Science for All Seasons series. You can find them all at broadinstitute.org/SFAS. And please consider joining us for our next Science for All Seasons talk on April 19th, where Eric Minikel and Sonia Valab will be telling us the story of their very personal work on genetic prion disease. A recording of tonight's talk will be posted right here on YouTube at youtube.com/user/Broad Institute. To find out about other live streamed events and other new videos from the Broad Institute, consider subscribing, and please ask your family and friends to consider subscribing as well. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and have a great night.